This is Trauma Care and Healing Movements. Welcome, everyone.
Hey. My name is Yardana Peacock, and I'm just opening up this amazing workshop, of which, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay for, but I'm going to watch the recording. This is Amber Burns-Jones is going to be facilitating tonight, and our guest and amazing teacher is Teresa Pasquale Mateus. I'm going to give a little wave. Who is a trauma therapist, specialist, a healer, a yoga practitioner, and just an all-around badass human being who we are so blessed to have in our presence. Teresa's led frontline work at Standing Rock and with Charlottesville, and I personally have learned so much from her, and we're really excited to have her tonight. Liberatory Leadership Project puts on these online workshops at the intersections of healing and spirituality and justice. And just a little heads up, our next workshop is November 3rd with Adrienne Murray Brown. It's going to be from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time, and we will send out that info to you all. So excited to learn and be in community with all of you, and to have this wonderful resource and conversation, participatory discussion, and workshop. It's going to be full of some awesome content with Teresa. And I'm going to hand it over to Amber Burns-Jones, who is a magical person, a mama, a poet, and holds down a lot at Liberatory Leadership Project as the coordinator of communications and community building, etc. So I'll hand it over to Amber.
Thank you, Yardana. I want to say welcome to Teresa again. We're so fortunate to have her here today to take us on this journey. Just to give you a short overview of this workshop, it's going to be 2 hours with Q&A opportunities throughout our time together. And please feel free to utilize the chat box during our presentation to engage with one another. This is going to be an overview of the traumatic impact of protests, movement work as a whole, as well as healing methods and practices to support ourselves and each other as we're doing this work. So I just wanted to open up the space with a breathing exercise. If you feel comfortable, please take this opportunity to close your eyes. So as you inhale, trace your breath within your nose and into your lungs. Exhale through your nose or mouth. Continue to take these deep breaths. Let your body lead. And just focus on your breath. And when you're ready, just open your eyes. Thank you, everyone. And now I'm going to turn it over to Teresa.
Okay, thank you for that opening breath practice. I think that's always, I appreciate community space that starts and ends and intersperses those things that we need to do that we can talk about all day. And I'm a total nerd for talking about trauma all day. But just even those little things that we do to regulate ourselves is so critically important. And the ways we pay attention to ourselves, I think one of the biggest things in movement work is that there's so much externally that has to be done that ignoring just the basics of breath become real easy. Just something as simple as that, as pausing to breathe. And I'm going to go into talking a little bit about the origins of trauma and what that looks like and how it looks in movements. But I think actually starting with talking about breath is really important to talk about trauma, because at the root of ourselves, we are sort of our primordial selves. Breath is the base level of who we are. We breathe from when we're born, we breathe till when we die. And one of the things I learned early on in my own trauma healing in my life, and then learned it scientifically in my practice as a therapist, trying to study how things worked and why they worked, was that breath, I'm trying to remember who specifically said this, but and Dr. Andrew Weil said breath is the master key. I read that somewhere. And when it comes to trauma, that feels really relevant, because it really is the master key to how our bodies are telling us if we're in distress or not. So the same way that deer in the forest and humans in our bodies, when we're in distress, our breath is the first thing that gets triggered to respond, and it actually then sends those signals to the rest of our bodies, sends those signals to our brain. So if you think of when you're in great distress, you'll usually stop breathing altogether, or you'll hyperventilate and breathe very quickly. And those are actually two sides of trauma response. So the hyperventilation is actually meant to prepare our body to run from something dangerous. And the stopping of our breath is meant for us to be able to be as invisible as possible. So whatever the bad, dangerous thing is can't get us. So even at the most basic level, our bodies equip us in these small ways to protect ourselves. And also when we're constantly put in stress response, our bodies don't know the difference between like bear in the woods or dangerous person in a dark alley, and then all the things that are triggering stress in our lives. So that same response can get triggered in our bodies over and over again, which signals our body and then our mind to be in distress. And so one of the things that I noticed specific to movements early on when I was sort of translating the work of doing trauma care and seeing how that connected with movement space and the pain and the stress and the trauma I was seeing there, was this constant re-stressing. So the first 8 years of my professional career was working with combat veterans and survivors of military sexual trauma. And so specifically the combat veterans had been put in multiple states of distress that were constantly repeating. And what was parallel about that in movement work is that if you think of front lines as just being different kind of front lines, it's a constant state of stress that people are being put into. And we can only take being put into constant states of stress so often before it gets stuck. So if we could pull up that first, it's the blue image, the one that's the symptoms of undischarged stress. Sorry. I have a handful of images. I try not to overdo too much content. Again, I get excited about trying to give everybody all the information, and we only have 2 hours. But I think this is important as a baseline, and picture images are always just more helpful in the ways that we can actually see what something is. So if we can pull up that blue diagram, and as we're doing that, one of the ways that I describe trauma and then traumatic stress and then PTSD, actually the other, not that one, oh, that's a terrible quality. This one, yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah, that one. When I talk about traumatic stress, I talk about the fact that it is our response to a natural danger getting stuck. And so if we think about what happens in movement work where there's constant state of stress, there's a constant baseline for something that you're either working in opposition towards or something that feels dangerous that's about to have, I mean, DACA is a great example, a terrible, great example of like imminent danger that is legislative, that people need to respond to, that is going to harm the lives or in relationship, the lives of those that you know, potentially immediately. So that idea that there's stressors that show up that require immediate action, that then your body and your mind are responding to that as if you're in danger because you are. And then you're actually trying to respond to that danger in real time in the work of movement space. It's impacting yourself or people that you know. And you don't actually have a moment to breathe or unstress or unstick, or at least it feels that way. That's really the biggest thing, is it feels like there isn't a moment to spare. And so what happens is you get stuck. You get stuck in that stress response, and it's difficult to be able to come back down out of that state of stress response. So sometimes I talk about it like turning on the light switch. When we get stressed out, we turn on a light switch. And if we have enough time to calm ourselves down and get back to a state of life where we aren't in distress, we can turn the light switch off. But if the stresses are constantly happening, which movement work is a constant movement into that space of distress to try to change something, then that light switch doesn't have a chance to turn off, which means whatever it is that's happening to you is getting stuck. And later we'll talk a little bit more about the community of movements, but that's happening both individually as a person inside of what the work yourself and the work you're doing, and then it's happening within a community of movement or movements that you're functioning within. So it's happening at a variety of different levels. This specific diagram, though, is talking about the individual level of experience. And so I think it's interesting because later I'm going to show a graph that looks like movement cycle stress. This is a graph that you could almost, in some ways, mirror on the movement cycle. The traumatic event could be, again, example of something like DACA, an imminent threat that then you have to respond to is the traumatic experience. And then your responses to that traumatic experience are going to ignite, are going to start responding. And then if you don't have a chance to come down from it, they're going to get stuck. So this diagram specifically, I haven't used before, but I thought it was interesting that they use the language of stuck on and stuck off. So that's just a really sort of simple way of talking.
It wasn't on speaker.
So that's just a really simple way of describing, like when I talked about the breath, the freezing up of your breath or the hyperventilation of your breath. The stuck on really means all those responses that are going to be heightened awareness, heightened attunement, but also it's going to create anxiety. It's going to create an ability to respond to everything around you that might be distressing. But once that happens too much, it's going to be, I hear a noise. Someone's behind me. Someone touched my shoulder. All of a sudden, it's not just the things that might be dangerous. You're literally so on alert that everything is putting you on edge. So it's this extreme response to everything is really the traumatic response, when it's beyond just this one thing happening right now, but instead I'm literally in that survival mode of the gotta run, hyperventilate mode all the time. And what I think is helpful and interesting also, what they relate to that, which I haven't seen on diagrams before, I think is really important, is chronic pain. So if our bodies are so hypercharged all the time that our adrenaline is going, our stress hormones are going all the time, our bodies are actually going to respond in distress. And longer term experience of distress in our bodies can equal things like chronic pain. So there are a handful of studies that have been done, particularly on sexual trauma, because that's just been something that's been studied more significantly than others. But survivors of sexual trauma have more common frequency of having things like fibromyalgia, endometriosis, cystic fibrosis, chronic conditions that some of which we know the origins of and some we don't, that are connected in some way with the autoimmune system being overworked. And so it's important to notice that when you start feeling run down as you're being stressed out all the time in the work that you're doing, when you're starting to be in pain, when your body's responding in those ways, they're all very much interconnected. That chronic pain and chronic illness is also really deeply connected with chronic stress, emotional stress. That our bodies are literally constantly signaling back and forth between our feelings in our bodies and our feelings and our emotions. So I think it's important to connect those two. And then again, some of the things we'll go into a little bit more when we talk about movement cycle and the way that it functions inside of movements. If you look at some of the emotional responses, so anxiety, panic, emotional overwhelm, restlessness and the inability to relax, hostility and rage, those are also things, if you think about for yourself or even other people in your communities, that can express themselves out when you've hit that peak level where you feel like you can't take anything anymore. And then it creates a complex set of other issues inside of movement communities, because then people are all maxed out, all under the most amount of stress. And then their trauma and their pain is then ricocheting off of everyone else. And then that pain is responding back. And so then it creates this friction inside of the community itself, which I have another diagram for in a little bit. And then on the stuck off on the lower end, that would be the example of the holding of the breath, the kind of trying to hold everything in rather than the overexpression of being ready to go and fight and struggle, is like trying to hold everything in, essentially, and trying to almost dull everything out. So it's that emotional numbing where, I've heard both extremes in terms of, and it can be it can be all in one person. You can have extreme levels of feeling really anxious. And then you can have that overwhelming feeling like, I can't actually feel anything anymore about the things that I'm working on because it's too much. I've heard too many stories. I've experienced too many things personally. And actually, I just need to shut off feeling altogether. And so then at the opposite end of anxiety is this feeling of, I actually can't feel. I don't want to feel anymore. I'm going to shut feeling off. So the stuck off is those literally just trying to essentially release, but not actually releasing, push down more so, all the feelings, all the negative emotions, all the stress and distress. So depression comes out of that, like extreme exhaustion and chronic fatigue, which also goes along with chronic pain sometimes, but it's the opposite end of that. Rather than your body being inflamed and alive with pain, it's that feeling of literally just not even wanting to get out of bed, and it being sometimes the depression emotional level, but also your physical body just going, nope, can't do it, not doing it. Disconnection and dissociation, I think those are important because they can happen at different levels. The most extreme version of dissociation is where you're literally disconnected to your own experience. So an extreme trauma, and somebody that has extreme levels of PTSD literally will fully check out of an entire experience, meaning somebody could say what happened in the last hour, and if they had been triggered and dissociated, they could say, I have no idea what happened in the last hour. But we all have versions of the way that we dissociate, so it may not look as extreme as that, but it's like being in a meeting talking about a specific thing and a painful story comes up and you just check out of how it feels in that moment. Or being in a place, in an environment that's deeply stressful, that may be an actual action where there's an overload of things happening, and you just check out completely from the experience of the moment. There can be more subtle ways to dissociate. So we can pull out of that diagram actually for a moment. And all of these, I think, Amber, we can have them accessible, right? And the links for these things accessible after, just so people know that you can see it again later. So generally speaking, stress looks like some combination of those factors. When we've been in distressful environments for too long, and we think about movements as a distressful environment, distressful working and emotional environment, and then depending on the number of ways in which you're personally marginalized and impacted, it becomes not just externally stressful, like the stress of the experience of the work of what you're taking on externally, but it's also the stress of what's happening inside. So a big piece of that comes out of things like intergenerational trauma, which we're finally learning more about, which is that ancestral trauma that isn't just what's happening in my body right now, but it's literally the memory in my body at a cellular genetic level of the pain of my ancestors. And that's a thing that people have known and felt, down to people going, I was in a certain place where my people came from, and I had a feeling, and it was a deep sadness, or it was a deep pain, but we didn't have language to say, science, Western world, science wants to always to validate what we're actually experiencing, even though the experience is the validation. And now we have science that can say, no, those weren't like all those years that people were saying they were having the experiences of that ancestral pain. That's not just a feeling, that's a fact. It's a genetic fact that we know now, that we carry the pain and the trauma at a genetic level of our ancestors. It doesn't mean that it's a permanent fixed thing, but it's important. I think the reason that the science is useful is not because it needs to prove itself to other people or to sort of a Western conception of things. What I like about science is that it gives us a way to see something physically. So we can say, it's not just something that's happening to me that I can't do anything about. It says that this is a scientific thing that I can look at and say, this was essentially intergenerational trauma is a thing that gets attached to our DNA. So trauma gets attached to us, then over generations, it gets attached to our DNA. So anything that gets attached can be unattached. That's the one thing I've learned from studying neurobiology and neurophysiology is our brain patterns can become something new when we've been traumatized. They can also become something new again when we decide and we figure out the ways to work against them, which we'll talk about more when we get into the healing piece. So I think it's important, particularly when I talk about something that seems so big like intergenerational trauma, also talking about the fact that this is not a negative thing to know this. It doesn't have to be the overwhelming, this is the end of the line situation and there's nothing I can do about it. The empowerment of this piece is we cannot change what happened to our ancestors. We can't necessarily change what's happening right now, but we can change our responses so that we can actually counteract the impact of that trauma in real time, which to me is exciting. It means this thing that has ancestrally carried itself throughout generations, we have the potential, because we know exactly how it's attached now, to do the work in this generation to change how it impacts us and then the future going forward. So moving in through that, I want to go to this is a really bad version of this diagram, but it's the one with it's the other one with the blue background, Amber, with all the sort of like layers in it. And I'm just going to go through it just real quickly. There's a video that you'll get a link to that has a much better version. This is like, I've looked all over and I cannot get a still image that is good of this. In the video, there's an organization called it's called White Bison, and they run a program called Wellbriety. They originate from the Lakota tradition. And a colleague of mine who is Lakota and now works in domestic violence with the Oneida Nation, Emma Eaglehart White, was the person that introduced me to the work of White Bison. And what I think is fascinating, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about the impact of their work when we go into the healing portion of the discussion. But what I love about their work is they've done the longest standing work I know of in terms of training people that have experienced intergenerational trauma in what does it look like and how do you actually heal it. And they come from an Indigenous perspective of how to do that, which I think is really critical, because if we're talking about something that was wounded at the core of who peoples were indigenously and tribally, then I also think the roots of how you heal that, much of that comes from a claim. But these diagrams, which again, I apologize, are fuzzy, but I'm just going to explain the metaphor of them because I think it's really powerful. What I described initially is really the individual impact of long-term stress. What Wellbriety program White Bison does in these diagrams are talking about is the collective impact of stress. So the idea that, yes, we are all impacted individually by what happens to us, and we can talk about this as much contemporarily in our communities as we can historically in our communities, when entire communities are distressed. So Lakota, coming out of the Wellbriety program, they're really talking about the genocide and the annexation of indigenous peoples of the North America. But we can look at a similar impact if we look at communities massively impacted by mass incarceration, right, or huge social distresses. It impacts the entire community, and in this metaphor at a root level. So the way that this image is created, or these images are created, are about the ideas that our whole roots of who we are, when it's grown healthy or when it's grown in pain and abuse and violence, is like at a sedimentary level. It goes deeper and deeper into the soil, the goodness, and then deeper and deeper into the soil when it's in distress. So the way that they describe it is that the original roots of indigenous community, and we can look at this across peoples across the world, the ways that we were originally rooted and grounded in deep community values, deep ritual ethic, principles that guided us to connect with each other and care for each other, a certain ecosystem of how that happened, particularly in tribal and indigenous communities, which is much less about anyone particularly holding. People had had seats of privilege, but not power in the way that we describe it in a Western construct. It was still very egalitarian in many ways. I don't want to universalize, but in a very different way in how the ecosystem functioned. So they talk about how the health of those values, those particularities, grew healthy communities. So the trees and the plant life that grew out of that was a sense of cohesiveness. It was a sense of an ability to connect with one another. It was a sense of interdependence, all these other factors. And then it talks about the ways in which all of those layers of soil were devolved and destroyed by the influx of colonization, the influx of violence and genocide and denigration of indigenous identity. All of these pieces coming into play begin to build the soil in an unhealthy and toxic way. It's literally like just putting poison into the soil and not letting it grow down all the way to the roots. And they talk about this idea that fear, shame, guilt, anger coming out of violence against entire peoples, eradication of entire tribes, the denigration of the cultures and the rituals that they held most dear, and then making those things illegal so they couldn't even practice them at all. The separation of communities from each other to create this individualistic sense of being that was dependent on, rather than interdependent, but dependent on colonizing forces, broke down everything that was good. And what built out of the earth of this toxicity was domestic violence, was suicidality in teens, was sexual violence, was alcoholism. So all these different things grew out of this unhealthy soil. And so thinking of these ideas, not just at our individual level of how trauma disrupts us, but at a cultural, communal, and in that intergenerational way, over generations as the soil becomes toxic, what grows out of it can't help but be equally toxic. And so the idea of repair is also thinking about what are we actually filtering back into the soil to nurture it in a way that something healthy can grow again. But also acknowledging that for many people and peoples and communities, that right now what is being offered to any of these ecosystems more than anything is toxicity rather than health, and thinking about it in those terms. So we can pull out of that diagram as well right now. And again, there's an entire video that a link will go out for that's called Journey to Forgiveness. That's just free on YouTube. That's a beautiful explanation of their whole narrative arc of how they describe, how they teach, and how they help to restore the soil, essentially, in their methodology of indigenous practices and indigenous reclamation, which I think is really important, especially when we're talking about not just movements as a whole, but again, the multiple ways in which many of us hold marginalizations, right? Everything from gender to sexuality to racial and ethnic histories, looking at not just what are we being impacted externally by, what are we being impacted internally by, but also what are our whole stories and our whole selves, and how are all of those pieces being impacted daily by the hard work that has to be done, but also has a direct impact on all those parts of who we are and where we come from. So that is a lot to open. That's a lot of information and a lot of diagrams. And I think I'd just like to take a moment to take a couple of breaths again. I want to really acknowledge that talking about this, even in an academic way, even in a technical way, is impactful to us in a personal way. So let's just take a few breaths on that information, just letting it settle and rest for a moment. Deep inhalation in, and a full deep sigh out. Another deep inhalation in, another full deep sigh out. Another deep inhalation in, and a full deep sigh out. And then just take a few moments to just check in with your body and just notice whatever is coming up or whatever your body is signaling to you in this moment. And like Amber is so well articulating with her body, if it feels like it needs to move or it needs to stretch, I think that you just made my body remind itself that it needs to do that. do whatever that feels like it needs in this moment. And also, I forgot before I started, I usually like to say this first, that anytime we talk about trauma, it can bring things up. So I also want to say that this is being recorded. And so if there's moments where something is triggering something in your own mind, in your own history, in your own body, you need to take a pause or a time out or put it on mute and step away. That I just want to give permission, not that it should be necessary, but just offering that out there. Because sometimes we forget that we can do those things to make those choices for ourselves. So if you do need to do that, just make sure that you're taking care of yourself as we talk through these concepts, and knowing that it's perfectly natural for them to bring up our own memories, our own histories, whatever we're holding in our bodies. And just take care of yourself regardless. And again, reminding that it's being recorded, so you don't miss anything, even if you have to do that. And I was going to go into movement cycle stuff, but that's really, I'd like to hold off on that for a second, because the content that we have already is a lot about the baselines of trauma. So maybe we can take a few moments now and be able to see if we can't answer some questions, if there are any at this point.
Thank you, Teresa, for that beautiful opening. So yeah, as Teresa said, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, and we're just going to do this popcorn style. Well, I can open us up. One of our participants, Mary Martinez, who is unable to be a part of this workshop tonight, but is going to be listening to the recording, sent us a question. And she says, how do folks continue the work, or really just continue, when are working with communities impacted by various forms of violence, day-to-day job, and the work we do outside the 9-to-5, and we're being re-traumatized by what's happening around us? There's a sense of hopelessness that hits sometimes. I would love to hear how others approach this. Teresa, I don't know if you were going to touch on that a little bit more later on, but I wanted to make sure that that question got out there.
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I can answer it in brief now, and then we'll definitely go more into content around that later. Something that I was taught early on in my clinical practice in therapy that I think carries over into every sphere is this concept of boundaried space. How do we create the boundaries that are taking care of us and nurturing what we need, and making sure that we don't overload what we're taking in from the outside? And I think both in caregiving work and in movement work, it may show up in different ways, how we're getting that information, or how we're absorbing people's stories. But really the experience of it is the same, in the sense of we can easily, especially if we care, which of course we do, and that's why we're doing all the things that we do, we can start absorbing everything to the point that we're identifying with it as if it's our own experience. Early on, when I was doing trauma therapy, like I'd said before, was with combat veterans. And it was first initially an internship before it became a job. And nobody had taught me about those internal boundaries. They taught a lot about clinical practice and skills. But what's interesting is, in any of this work, we are least equipped to take care of ourselves. Even in helping work and activism work, people don't teach that. That's not the primary forward content. So I hadn't been taught that. But I also thought, well, I'm a trauma survivor, but I'm a sexual trauma survivor. Predominantly, I'm helping combat veterans. Well, that's totally different than my experience. So clearly I'll have distance from it. It's just automatically going to happen. And then about a month and a half in, I started having some weird things start to happen. Like, I started having repeated dreams where I was in war zones and I was being shot. And very specific, down to details and of the full experience. Some of them very reminiscent of the actual things that I had been hearing. And then I started to, when I would see garbage in the road, I would start to swerve instinctually as if it was a IED, improvised explosive device, which I've never experienced before. So there's no content in my actual person as to why I would be responding to things that I've not experienced at all as triggers to traumatic stress. So I realized, one, if I'm going to keep doing this work, I'm going to have to create somehow I'm not creating a separation that I need. And a real way to be aware that the stories, what I'm absorbing is not my own, right? So how do I hold space for other people's pain? And how do I work into helping them through that pain? And do it in a way in which I'm not actually absorbing all of that pain, because I just knew that I'll last for a minute. If I'm absorbing everybody's pain, 8 hours a day, 8 people a day, 5 days a week. And so for me, it was creating this internal way to sit with people. And it actually was a very physical experience of being able to sit with people and hear stories and know as I was starting to absorb them, like I could feel that feeling of them getting all the way in there, but I would take a breath and I would create a little separation inside of myself where I was almost just reminding myself, like, that is another person, their story is right there. I am right here with them, but I am not in their story. I am not inside of their experience. And how do I actually almost as a visualization, pull myself back from that story enough so I can hear it, but I don't become it. And in some ways, how we do that can look different, but I think that sort of imagery of actually pulling back out of the emotional experience of a thing is a good baseline practice. Now, that's not the whole picture. And when we get more into the healing content, we'll talk more about ways that I think structurally we can build into movements and structurally we can build into our lives so that we can sustain ourselves. But at a baseline, that internal boundary of what's mine and what isn't, I think is important to keep doing the work. And sometimes it feels like if I'm not holding it all, then I'm not being authentic to the work, or I'm not being good enough. And so people have shame and guilt and are, and feel like that's a negative thing. But actually it's the way we sustain ourselves, because there's no human way to hold everyone's story as if it's our own.
Now I'd like to acknowledge the folks that are on the phone. Does anyone on the phone have any questions? Okay. Teresa?
Yes.
All right, would you like to continue?
Yes. So the next sort of portion of what we're going to talk about is moving into the movement cycle and how specifically movements as a whole can experience trauma and distress. But I'd like to set that up before I go into it by talking about how this sort of came through to me in a way that was really powerful and that I felt like was going to be helpful in terms of talking about trauma and the movement. I was at a training a few years ago where Movement Net Labs, which is based out of New York City, came and did a presentation on the movement cycle, which we'll go into the image for in a second. But I'm sitting there and hearing them discuss this sort of ebb and flow of movements. And really, so this is like 3-ish years ago. And this is really a bridge moment for me. I've been mostly doing individual care and practice and being called into more sort of spiritual. But organizing and movement work wasn't my first forward work. So I was sort of at the beginning of entering into this phase of transition of trying to understand and learn how movements function better, could help support people in movements better. And when I saw this diagram go up and this sort of very similar to developmental cycles image, I just heard it described in the way that movements function, in the way that they were articulating movements functioned or could become dysfunctional. I realized it patterned itself, one, out of an emotional cycle of distress, the way that I would understand it. And it started to connect for me, just the beginnings of, oh, well, now it makes sense that these certain feelings are happening, or people are experiencing certain things at different parts of the movement cycle. Because if I look at that as this whole process of development that's happening in the activist community, in the movement community, and then I look at the individual things I'm seeing happening to people that they're describing, I can almost map out between the two how they're actually a story together, that they're not individual stories, that it's actually one whole big picture. And that was really powerful for me, because one, it connected the work of healing and particularly understanding trauma function. And for me, it was just a seed planting that I've only been able to kind of begin to move into in terms of talking about it and training about it. But it was a seed planting of, there's a way to put these together so we can all understand it better. So it doesn't feel like, for people that are inside of movement space, that this is just, I don't know what's happening, I feel overwhelmed. And then again, that inherent feeling of guilt and shame, because I can't hold everything and I should be able to hold everything. And so then that guilt and shame means that people don't talk to each other about it. So how would you even know that anyone else might be experiencing the same thing? And I think what is really helpful in that last 3 years I've seen, and sadly, because of the increased level of crises in movement, in the work that needs to happen because of the external world, because of the political world, I have the good that has come out of that, or the awareness that's come out of that I've seen, is people really want to understand how these things connect now. Like, it wasn't as important 3 years ago. It was like, we got to do the work, we got to get things done. And so people were like, well, that's great, that healing thing, but like, if we have time for it later, right? Or when I take a vacation, something like that, which of course never happens, right? So, but what I've seen in the last few years, and I can even say really distinctly in the last maybe 6, 8, 10 months, is people going, wait, like, we actually can't move forward without figuring out what this stuff is. We can't move forward without understanding what's happening to us. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the time I spent in Charlottesville and Standing Rock as a relationship to that. We can't even heal properly if we're not also looking at how our structures are functioned, how our organizing is functioned, and what needs to shift for us to be able to sustain ourselves individually and sustain ourselves together. So if we can pull up that the movement cycle image, that would be great. So I'm in the process of working with, those of you that are at Liberation School may have heard Kate Werning talk about this some when you were at your training, I think last week. Her and I are working on a way to take sort of her movement first, healing, so she was steeped in movement work and then came into healing work, and I was steeped in healing work and came into movement work. And so those two perspectives to look at the movement cycle and work on creating actually a whole paper that explains how these things overlay, and beginning to conceptualize how we might structurally be able to create things that are bolstering people at each stage of this. So there's a longer project in terms of putting these parts together, but it was so, it's so critical for me to see these things, emotional health and movement health together, that I do want to talk through just a little bit of this. So I don't know how many of you have seen this diagram coming out of the Movement Net Lab, but what it basically describes, and it's interesting if you even think back to the diagram before, if you imagine overlaying that a little, they call it actually trigger event, the thing that happens. So if you think about that, that's actually coming out of language. It's very similar to how we talk about trauma response, right? So even that, getting stuck coming out of stress and distress in that other diagram that called it traumatic event, a trigger event very much, it may be the catalyst for pushing new movement work forward, but a trigger event is essentially traumatic, right? It is new legislation around DACA. It is, increased funding of new carceral state institutions. It's, we can go all the way back, increased legislation that are meant to target people of color around drug trafficking, or what they call drug trafficking. It's all the attempted border laws and restrictions and regulations. So the trigger event, it's good language, I think, in trauma language, because it really is something that's traumatic, something that ignites people in movements. We got to do something right now. We got to make a plan right now. And so moving out of whatever that trigger event is, and you can see before the trigger event is growing public anger. So it means there's a building towards that trigger moment, but something that fully ignites the thing that has to happen next to happen. And what happens is, much like a traumatic event, a trigger event creates this, what I've been calling, so they call it the heroic phase. Emotionally, I've been calling also the manic phase. I call it the manic movement phase. So it is in that state of distress, something has to happen right now. If we don't try to make something happen right now, then in trauma language, the really bad thing could happen. And so we have to put all of our effort, all of our energy into working towards whatever it is that we're trying to do to halt the system from doing this thing, or to bring public awareness to what's happening. But I call it the manic phase because if you think about it in terms of like mania actually in mental health, not to call this a mental health issue, because I'd like to distinguish between that. I have a real pet peeve about when we overly stigmatize mental health by saying something is mental health, like Trump is insane. Well, Trump is a sociopath and narcissist, but I won't hold that against people that have actual mental health issues, because that's a choice for one set of people and it's not a choice for others. So I'd like to distinguish sometimes between what is mental health and isn't. But the manic phase doesn't mean that people are in a state of mental illness, but it does mean they're in a state of distress, and that's different. It means that the mania that's pushing everything forward says, we can't stop. Right? So what happens when you can't stop? You're very productive, but it also means you're not sleeping, right? So when people are working towards on a campaign or working towards a certain initiative, or that impulse of the very thing that has to happen immediately, you're getting a lot done, but people stop sleeping. They start spending, 10, 12 hours a day, 10, 12 hours at a time, working on whatever that thing is, not being able to turn off anything, social media, email, whatever all those things are that are keeping you informed about everything that you need to be doing, or how whatever the momentum is you're working towards needs to shift because this just happened, or this article just came out, or we just found out about, the president just made this announcement. Whatever those things are creating this constant state of this sort of manic state. You have to be completely 100% on. And what happens also is if you think of a collective of people working inside a whole community of movement building together, all functioning in this sort of manic state of being, lots of stuff happens, right? Like anger. I get real pissed. I'm getting pissed off because this has to happen next, and this person didn't do that, or that person's talking to that person about how we should be doing this instead of that, and I found out that, but there isn't enough time to actually address any of those things, right? So people are just getting pissed off at each other and not talking about it, not dealing with it, not handling it. Maybe somebody explodes, but everybody's like, just keep it going, right? Like you see it literally is like this giant uphill movement in the diagram. That's it. Just keep going, keep going. I hate you now. I'm never talking to you again. But like, nobody's saying that, but just keep moving. So much brokenness and pain is ricocheting off of each other in those moments. And everybody feels like it's life or death because, again, it really is critical. But at the same time, everybody's getting harmed. Everybody's getting broken down. Everybody's getting burnt out and not even realizing it, because when you're still in that heroic manic phase, you're just going on adrenaline. It is like trauma, right? It is like survival mode because you're going on the adrenaline of what needs to happen next. And what comes after the heroic phase is the honeymoon phase. So that could be multiple things, right? That could be something good happens that we actually was part of our aim and our goal. That can be, it kind of dwindled out because we didn't get to build it. We tried to build all this momentum and then it just didn't get traction, or we got it as far as we could, but the legislation we were trying to shift didn't move. Whatever it is, it's something that pauses the work after that huge surge of action. Pause is the work. And this is, so honeymoon moving into disillusionment, that little curve, right, as it starts to descend, is, again, when I started to see this laid out in terms of movements and people, is real dangerous. Because what happens is everybody's exhausted. So they're just going home to crash. Nobody's dealt with the emotional pain that everybody has gone through that was unresolved during that manic phase. People get separated from each other because they're like, I can't right now. I need a minute, you know? And so that community that was working together towards this thing isn't necessarily the community that's holding each other in this space of whatever it is after. And so one of the extreme examples that I've seen of this honeymoon into disillusionment phase is like people hitting massive just depression streaks, you know, and not leaving their house. People self-medicating to just kind of like let go and release all of that unprocessed energy. And even most extremely in Chicago last winter, fall, in the spring, we had a couple of really young BLM organizers that had been carrying so much through the heroic phase with very little support, and so young that they didn't even have the inner resources yet, you know, to build that inner resilience, and then becoming suicidal. And so that's the most extreme level of what happens in that I see in that narrative arc, is people don't know how to get access to help. They don't know who can be supportive in their community. There's also that guilt and shame of, I can't reach out to somebody else for help because everybody's already holding so much. And so everybody's just crashing internally alone. And so that can be a real painful time, a real distressing time where things kind of fall apart. And then disillusionment is meant to sort of be that dip. And so in a healthy movement, in our ideal situation, there are ways for all these parts to function healthfully. Again, we just haven't really been taught how to do that. And so they're just functioning like just the get by, let's get it done. And so you don't just lose impact or momentum in that honeymoon to disillusionment. You lose people who go, I can't do it anymore. This isn't sustainable, right? So I don't know how many clients I've seen. I'm sort of shifting out of my individual clinical practice, but so many clients that I've seen out of movement work that are, they're like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm getting a PhD. There's a lot of people transitioning to academia, which is interesting because it's a way to create impact, but also to be distanced from what's actually happening on the ground because people are so tired. And these are people that are like, they're 10 years in, but they're only in their 30s, right? And they're so exhausted they can't keep going. And that's not, and that's, I just keep seeing happen over and over again. And so when you move it through that honeymoon disillusionment phase, people don't only just go into distress, but you also lose people who just feel like they can't do it again. But in your ideal situation, or in building a healthier ecosystem of movement, this understanding that these parts are going to happen and creating ways to support people, and we'll talk about it again when we get to the healing in each of these phases, can make it so that not a single one of these has to be catastrophic on the whole, and that it can be supported more completely. But when we're not, that's what creates all this collateral damage. And then disillusionment, when it dips down and it hits its bottom, movements and communities start to build back together, you know, and at its best, it does learning and reflection, like what worked, what didn't, what do we need to do, what are we working towards again? And really, and the truth is, even with the pain that's inherent in there, there's beautiful ways that new things are always growing out of, you know, that narrative arc of movements, you know, new, smaller campaigns, or larger scale actions. I mean, learning and reflection and regrowth is happening, and people are building towards the next thing that comes. But the ideal is for that to actually feel sustainable and not constantly feel like this manic up and down, high and low, community, you know, bound together in survivalism and then totally separated from each other. Also in a different kind of survivalism that my hope and my belief is that there's a way to do it that's sustainable for people, but that we haven't really talked about before, so it's understandable that it has felt just the way it's felt for people. So, okay, we can pull out of that diagram. And again, before I move on, I do want to give a moment, because the movement cycle, talking about it in that way as both a cycle of movements, even if you've seen that diagram before, which not everybody has, but some have, talking about it overlaid with emotional health is maybe a different way to look at things. So if we could take a moment again and see if anybody does have any questions or even just reflections around that. I'd be glad to hear people's reflections as well.
All right. I believe Jenny had a message that they'd like to share.
Hi, Teresa. Yes, I had asked a question just about how, and maybe I said this might be my privilege speaking because I am sort of new to this, and I understand that other communities have been re-traumatized over and over historically and before my awareness. But at least here in Charlottesville, that we sort of keep repeating the triggering event. I just wonder sort of what that does to the cycle if you keep getting kind of snapped back to that moment rather than moving forward through the stages. Is that pretty typical, or is that something to think about differently in those cases?
So when you're saying repeating the trigger event, do you mean like just continually coming back to that story?
Yeah. And so, for example, in Charlottesville, weekend before last, Richard Spencer and his crew were back in town with torches, and there was a very quick call to mobilization and community defense. And I think a lot of us are feeling on edge that this is the new normal with these sort of traumatic events happening on a regular basis. And I don't know, is that unique, or is that sort of the way it goes and I'm just new to this and need to get used to it?
Yeah, so it's both, and I think it's good to take a moment to talk about Charlottesville specifically, because it also is a unique, I think, distinctive moment and situation. So I'll say a couple of things, because I think it's helpful for movements in general, and it also, I think, speaks to where we are right now. So there's a few things. So first of all, one, yes, some of it is normal, that there's certain cyclical things that will repeat. And then also what I thought you were talking about initially, another piece of that is our tendency to return back to our traumatic response to a particular moment too. Mm-hmm. But I think what is specifically, so I spent a week doing some trauma work in the week after everything happened in Charlottesville. And I think what I noticed most distinctly there, more than Standing Rock and more than any sort of other kind of aftercare before, is that it's the closest to combat I've seen from combat in these ways. Mm-hmm. So combat, when somebody's actually in a deployed zone or in a combat zone, where it's actually, it's a dangerous environment even when there isn't a fight, right? When there isn't something actually physically happening, because the environment itself has become like a targeted area. And so you're constantly in a state of distress because the dangerous thing hasn't left. And I think what was unique when I was there in Charlottesville, and I saw the incident that you were talking about where he came back in, Richard Spencer came back in, is an example of that continuing. Is Charlottesville is unique in that it's a smaller community, right? It's not a huge urban city. So even when I was there talking with people, I was like, this is different. This is a place where people know each other in a more intimate way, right? Like, so if there's a major action in the middle of New York City and everyone disperses, there isn't going to be random guy in the crowd necessarily that's going to be able to follow you home or find out your information. So there's also something very unique about smaller communities being impacted by major events, and major events that include local people. Mm-hmm. So what was very specific about Charlottesville is, sure, there were people that, like Nazis, that were flown in, that drove in, but there's an organic community that is trying to make itself more visible, that was sort of the ground forces to start up what happened there. So it was most similar to me too, that kind of combat zone environment where the level of distress, just because an actual action isn't happening, isn't actually alleviated, because you are still small, because people do know who each other is, and because the danger hasn't left. So I would say it's both and. I would say, yes, there are elements of returning to level kinds of distress and kinds of interactions that are going to be part of that sort of cycle of the movement. And then there's unique factors in particular areas and particular moments in time. So everything that's happening in Charlottesville is very particular to our moment in time and this kind of new kind of stress and distress. So I think it's a very specific kind of thing to learn how to live in a space that doesn't feel the way it did before for valid reasons, right? Because sometimes our stress is responding to things that aren't valid. But there's valid stressors in Charlottesville still, to people being in that sort of state of distress and response. And what that can do, same way that it happens in combat, is it can also create this sense of constantly not being able to stop, right? Like, so people to an extreme level, even beyond regular movement activity in that sense. So literally, like the week after all the incidents happened, there were people, people were terrified. They thought somebody was following them home. And so there were people that were like getting up at 1, 2, 3 in the morning to drive, across town to make sure somebody was getting in their house. And then even as some of the most imminent danger was dissipating, people were still in that state of, again, it comes from that feeling of, I have to do it all. I have to be it all. Like, I'm going to protect everyone. I'm going to be there for everyone, which is very much a sort of combat response in that sense of like, I have to protect my brothers and sisters on the front line. But also we have to find a baseline too, right? Like, so if Charlottesville has a new normal, how do you maintain that still in that state of distress without totally burning out by everything becoming the most urgent thing, by everything becoming as if it was as dangerous, as that one weekend, because it isn't all as dangerous. It's important to be more alert, because that's real, but also how do you find that balance? And I think Charlottesville it seems to me, is in the process of figuring out its new normal around that. And that's a traumatic stress process for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Really helpful.
So we have some action in the chat box. Sean, would you like to share the question that kind of came up within Liberation School, or would you like me to read it?
I can share. In the session where there was a specific session where Kate was talking about this exact thing. And in both the going through the trauma cycle and going through the movement cycle, we were looking at a sort of question mark at the same point, which is, how do we think about the support structures that are built for folks that are like, in the trauma cycle, going through the like stuck on and stuck on off phase, and then trying to come back into normality, and in the movement cycle, where that's defined as the learning and regrowth phase. And then for movement building specifically, thinking about like, the way that it's drawn, the regrowth is higher than the beginning, the like existing in anger. So like when you go through the cycle, hopefully there's learning and growth so that you end up in a like higher place in terms of like being able to learn or build more power or whatever the goal is. And so when we're thinking about the cycle of movement building, how do we set up support structures within our organizations and like within the work so that we're able to come out of the valley and like be ready to re-engage in the cycle or proactively organize a trigger event that is on our terms instead of responsive or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I can't speak to that some, but one of the exciting parts for me is that I think we're also in a formation, we're in a formative moment too, where like defining how we structurally create those things is a really open field. So I'll speak into that for in a couple of ways in sort of how I'm perceiving it right now. one thing that came, so there's multiple levels, like how does the structure of organizing and building movements actually create more fertile soil so that movements can grow? And then I think the other thing is, how are we also instilling and installing a way of being that prioritizes healing and healing conversations as more critical? And I think those work together, but they're not identical things. So one of the things that was really helpful for me being doing work at Standing Rock, particularly I was doing healing and mental health care, was that to me it's the microcosm of all the parts of our lives, but it was situated in one community structure, right? So like a community had been built around an actual, we are doing this thing, right? Like this is our movement and this is what's happening. And then an entire structure of community had been built around it. So it made everything really accessible in a way that we are not connected, that made it really clear that we are not connected to all the different parts of our community. By being so close proximity, right? So you have your mental health and medical zone of teepees, right? And then like off to the side, you have your organizing and direct action training, which happens every day. So every new person that comes in the community is trained in direct action. And what I loved about it, not just direct action, but Indigenous oriented, specific to the community that you are in, structured direct action. So it was very specifically, we are coming in as an Indigenous organization, but to train you specifically in this movement, specifically out of the Lakota context, right? So it's fascinatingly, intentionally particular, right? The healing was intentionally particular. So it was also Indigenous forward. So everybody that joined the mental health and medical team got this giant manual that was Indigenous medicine first, right? So like whether you came in and you had been practicing Western medicine for however long, you had to learn what herbs you were supposed to use, because that should be the thing you're doing first. So I thought it was very intentionally particular to centering who needed to be centered, the voices in the teaching, and also then healing is here to the right, and direct action training is to the left. And if you walk a little ways down the road, that's where the actual action was happening, or actions were happening, where at either end of the community. And in the center, everyone was living and being fed by each other, literally. And spiritual practice was happening around the sacred fire that started every morning, that closed out every night, and that was happening inside of everything, right? So it was this beautiful example of the potentiality of what I think could be created, right? There's no silos. Spirituality is inherent to how you're healing and how you're doing your action. Your action is directly connected to your healing and your spirituality, that they are all part of this web, and they're all accessible to each other and in conversation with each other. And one of the things I started doing, because I realized the direct action training was they were having educational pieces that were offered every day from the legal team and from the medical team. So like basic, like first aid, like frontline first aid, right? Like, like what to do if you get sprayed by chemicals and basic stuff. And legal was like, write the number on your arm, really like just the basics of what needed to happen. And I was like, why are we not talking about trauma and mental health? Because we're sending people to the front lines of these actions, and why isn't that a piece? And so I started going every day and doing a little like, this is trauma, this is what it looks like, this is what can happen when you're at the action, this is how you can support people in an action if they're in distress, and this is where you can go. And again, it's real accessible right over there to those teepees. You can go to those teepees after the action if you're in distress, and you can come see us. And there's going to be a team of us at every action. So if you see people with these armbands, that we're going to be at the action, and there's going to be more of us that are back at the tents. And for me, that created a healing structure that I had never been able to embody before, where everything was so deeply connected with each other. And it gave me this potentiality, of what was possible. So from the healing side of things, like I came back and I was like, why don't we, when people are working towards a particular, so when we're in that heroic phase and people are building towards an action, the movement building, why don't we have at meetings basic and I'm not saying people don't do this anywhere, but I've never seen it en masse as part of a protocol in movements, that we're training people what trauma is, how to look out for it, And guess what? Here are all like the supports that have agreed to be networked in our local community, you know, in Chicago, so that when you leave your action, we move through the heroic phase and people are going into disillusionment, they already have paper that lists who's on there. They've already met maybe 5 of them from those people coming to different meetings. So they're not disconnected from the supports that they could possibly have. And why aren't we having more emotional care triage that isn't inherently built into, and more organizing is doing this, but like, again, it's like a protocol, like frontlines emotional health triage. And Charlottesville was another example of multiple tiers of that, right? So like, you need people that are able to support a frontline action as it's happening, but then those people are going to be traumatized if something happens, you know? So then you actually need like backlines triage of people that can potentially even come in from outside the community and be able to provide support more like a Red Cross kind of way. So I'm in the process right now of trying to work on a activist trauma triage training process to actually train people to be like Red Cross type, be able to go in and support communities in like the immediate aftermath of crisis. But so that's a piece of it. To me, there's all this potentiality of things that we can build that we haven't even thought about before. And Standing Rock really opened me up to what was possible. And that's just from the healing perspective. So I also think there's a lot of room, and this is the piece where I would love to actually dig in deep, and Kate Warney and I have been talking about this, like how do you actually help movements build infrastructure in, so every step of the movement cycle, there's ways in which you're building a way of being that creates the possibility, not just for the healing piece, but for an ecosystem of how the soil is being grown, how the community is being built from the foundation up. So it's not just like Charlottesville is also another example of like the movement for many people in that space was built up out of a space of urgency, right? Like all of a sudden there was this like impending Nazi sort of incursion. And so many of the people I met from movements, the primary organizing had been started just a few months earlier, and it had all been in and out of a state of distress. So then how do you also take, even when that has to happen, how do you pause and build movements that have a communal ethic, an ethos, a way of being an ecosystem with one another that's healthier? And that one, I don't have like a template for what that looks like. I think it could look a lot of different ways depending on what where you are and who you are and what your community group is. But I think there's potential there, both for layering and healing throughout the entire movement cycle, and layering in a way of being in community with each other that maybe looks different. I think were there other questions? I was missing what was happening in the chat.
Yes. So we have quite a few questions and comments. Thank you everyone for being so engaged in this conversation. Let's see. Mary, I believe, had a question. Mary, would you like me to pose this question? So Mary says, could training also include some preventative information, like learning how we can avoid further traumatizing each other within an action or within the movement in general?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's I think that's important in the continuum of being able to, and moving that into less about, here's 5 minutes, right? Like just to hear about mental health service in your area. But I think that goes into the building of the structure of movements where people decide that this is essential, right? And that we're not tacking it on or adding it on the side, for a few minutes at a meeting, but actually in the way that you're building up movements that parts of this education can happen throughout, and in a bunch of different contexts. And yeah, I absolutely think that a piece of that groundwork is also talking about how are we traumatizing people in movements, and how can we be preventative care. Yeah, I think that's critically important as part of it.
Thank you, Teresa. We also have a question from Brad. Brad says, I love the place-based solution from Standing Rock. What does this look like in dispersed movements? Where can artists be most helpful, both in place-based movements and dispersed movements? So I think that's a great question. Yeah,
that is a great question. And I think the arts are also rising up and and are underplayed in terms of their healing value. So what I love about the arts, and so when I was working at the VA, part of my intentionality in building out programming was how is it experiential? How are you feeling it in your body? How is it expressed in your imagination? And so creative arts programming was really important. And in movements, I see there's so much potential, not just for bringing the arts, but for the arts themselves being a space of healing and repair. So one of the wonderful things that I learned from geeking out over neurobiology is this, talking about the idea before of genetics that can change, the idea that the brain can change. Some of you may have seen recently, there's like in the last 5 or so years, there's been a whole bunch of books written about like changing your brain and the psychology of brain change. And if you Google that, you'll find like 10 or so books at least that are talking about that. But what I love about that in terms of, they started talking about the ability for the brain to change in terms of like physical health. And then they realized specific to things like trauma, it's just as relatable. So we have something called neural pathways, which I call like racetracks in our brain. So they create thought patterns and image patterns. And so when we've been inundated with pain and suffering, the thought patterns and the image patterns that are running through our brain that have been most replicated and most tread over are the painful ones. And so that's why they stand out the most. That's why they're the strongest. And one of the greatest ways to counteract those pain expressions in the brain is by creating new neural pathways. And the primary way of creating new neural pathways is creative expression. So when we envision or we imagine or we draw or we write a new thing, we're actually creating a new pathway in our brain. And the more that we create those new pathways, the more that we counteract the storyline that says only the painful things exist, only the bad things exist. And it doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge their existence. Like I think in talking about healing, which we'll close out on, is we need to lament, right? Like one of the things I spend a lot of time talking about, like racial identity and inclusion to white spaces. And one of the things that's common, not necessarily in movement space, but in dominant culture, is white Western culture wants to move through pain very quickly, moving to unity without process. And that's also damaging, right? So our creative expression can also be expressions of lament, expressions of grief, but it's also about creating those things that bring us into our full potential and empowerment and being able to vision outside of just the pain and suffering that we've been offered. And so the creative arts are an amazing way to do that. I've been working on this conference for my nonprofit, Mystic Soul, which I'm very excited about. And creative arts has been critically important in that. And just to use that as an example of like reclamation is healing, we have a handful of projects. One is the projects that are also creative expression that people get to engage with, that then are going to be art installations. So we have a woman coming in, Ellie Yang Camp, who's going to be doing a calligraphy project where she's going to teach people calligraphy and origami, and people are going to write their experience of microaggressions on these cranes. So we'll have hundreds of cranes that will be exhibiting microaggressions that will turn into an art installation that will close out the conference. So to me, that's an example of, one, it's a reclamation of history, right? For her, it's like reclaiming of the calligraphy and origami that come from her cultural Japanese history. It's also a way of expressing art as both being lament and also being social action. So we're going to say that these things happen, these microaggressions, but then great production of beauty, this emblem of, but look what also this makes, right? This makes a room full of cranes that are flying in the air, that are also beautiful, that are also an expression of solidarity. So I just think the arts are, there's so much potential there in how we bring all of it together.
My spirit was smiling the whole time you were talking about it. Beautiful, beautiful. I'd like to open it up for anyone on the phone that'd like to ask a question and didn't have the opportunity. Okay, if there are no questions, Teresa, would you like to continue?
Sure. Yeah, and I see somebody talking about St. Louis as well, and activist trauma training. I think like Charlottesville, St. Louis, there's also very specific places in this moment. Some, the question before was also talking about place-based and dispersed movements. I think we're in this really ebb and flow place where there's distinct places where there's energy that people are having to rise up against certain things. And that also means repeated trauma. So it also means more care. So I'd be glad to talk about coming to somewhere like St. Louis and being able to do specific activist-based trauma, because I think we need it everywhere. And then there's also places where there's an urgency, to have that support because people are being inundated by so much right now. And then somebody else had asked, sorry, I just want to real quick touch on asking about pastoral care and chaplaincy fits into the support structure. Actually, the pilot training that I'm doing in Chicago in December with a colleague that's going to pilot this activist trauma triage training, is going to be a mix of like mental health general healer professionals, and then also chaplains, because my colleague's background is in chaplaincy, but this idea that there is a spectrum of ways in which people are healed, right? There's traditional mental health that I don't think in and of itself is the answer, but people having the training and understanding and knowledge base of that I think is important. And then spiritual care and pastoral care, and then this sort of huge conglomerate of like what people are starting to call healing justice at the center. That's all of the diversity of these different ways of healing. I think we need everyone, right? We need everyone right now. So I think that absolutely the pastoral and chaplaincy piece has a role. And also just another expression that I saw both in Standing Rock and those people, well, actually in Charlottesville, I specifically had chaplains and pastoral care people come up and say, we didn't actually know what to do because we haven't been trained to do this. Like, we're going to need help. And we feel like there's going to be more need in the future, which is also part of where the trauma triage training idea came out of, was like, people want to help and we're going to need everyone that we can get. And people have not been trained for this, right? Some people have been trained on trauma, but maybe they've been in therapy practices just doing that, right? Some people are trained in movements, but don't have the awareness of how it connects. And then there's almost nobody at that intersection point of like, how is trauma specific to movements? And that's critical, because to help people in that state of distress, you have to understand all the parts. And combat trauma in a war zone is specific, and domestic violence is specific, and activist trauma is specific. And so knowing the specifics is also is equally critical. So yes, so I'd like to go into healing. I think that's important. We talked a lot about what happens and how it hurts, right? So the important thing is to also be able to discuss what healing can look like. And I'd like to I'm going to talk a little bit more about the trauma triage, but I'd like to start, and I'm going to talk about reclaiming ancestry. But I'd like to start with this idea that really came to the surface actually specifically with my work inside of movements, and speaks to maybe some of those structural pieces of how we shift, how the movements are formed and shaped, and how we care for each other in community. But it's this idea of self-care. I've been starting to talk about beyond self-care, because self-care is very individualistic, and it puts a sole responsibility on an individual to figure out what they need and go get it. And oftentimes that's also something that costs money, right? So what I noticed a lot in working with people, or people coming up to me about stress inside of movement work, was they were like, when I get burnt out, the general suggestion is just self-care, like this sort of lump it together idea that self-care will fix it. And so go get a massage, or get your nails done, or go to a yoga class. And all those things are good. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But one massage, one yoga class, one getting your nails done, and then running back into the work because you already feel like you took too much time out, is not healing, right? It's not restorative. And sometimes it actually can work against you, because if you haven't been able to change the ethic, and this is where it comes down to like the ethic of movements, if you haven't been able to change the ethic of how, somebody sounded one. If you haven't been able to change the ethic of how movements identify caring for ourselves, prioritize caring for ourselves, and how we've been able to relearn caring for ourselves is important, then you're going to run off and do the one thing, feel bad that you did it, have spent money that maybe you didn't have, and then run right back into the work. And on top of that, you're going to reinforce the fact that self-care or those practices don't work, because you're going to run back in and not be healed, not be rested, and then feel like, well, that doesn't work. So, people keep saying self-care. Self-care doesn't work, right? And then be too ashamed or guilty that it didn't work to really talk to anybody about it. So it creates this vicious cycle of like both shame and lack of actual repair. And the reason is because it is more of a structural community ethic of understanding that we have to take the time to take care of ourselves. It has to be built into the way in which movements function, not just independent of each other, because we're working on social change together. We can't separate off care into this category that you're supposed to be now independent and Western model, but we're supposed to work together on the hard stuff over here, but we're not working together on the hard stuff over there. So all of it has to be interspersed. And again, it doesn't mean that a yoga class and a massage isn't good, but it means that it needs to be part of a continuum of care that's built into how a movement functions, how community organizations decide that they are going to be for themselves. And another thing, again, that came in when I was working in Charlottesville was this realization that although we were talking about the crisis of the moment, we couldn't really move forward even in my ability to support them if we weren't talking about how the movement was functioning in that moment, how the community organizations were functioning in that moment, and how people were functioning inside of them in that moment. Because again, you're going to do triage and then you're just going to jump right back out in there and nothing will have changed in the structure of how the community is built. So I spent also a good amount of time talking about how the community can be restructured in a way that actually puts care paramount and supports each other in caring and cares for each other in ways that are very intentional and that are set forth essentially in the guidelines of how that community functions. And I was talking to a number of people also about how you model that for your community too, right? So if you say, particularly if you're holding like voice and leadership and any kind of power in that space, if you say like, I am prioritizing sleep tonight, right? And so like, I'm not staying at the meeting for 3 more hours. And actually somebody in Charlottesville did this very thing and I was so proud of her. She came back the next day and she was like, I went to the meeting and I told people I am leaving now to get 8 hours of sleep. And then I said, I'm doing it for me and I'm doing it for the community, like you said, and I did it and it was good for everyone. And I was like, that's great. So it's like, it's this whole thing too, that like, rather than it being a guilty thing, right, a guilty endeavor for me to go home and get 8 hours of sleep is I'm doing this for the community, right? I'm doing this for the community because one, I won't exist in the community if I don't get 8 hours of sleep right now. I'm doing it for the community because if I don't model getting 8 hours of sleep, everyone else is just going to keep going, right? If we think of that manic state of being, because they think we all have to keep going, right? So it's just, I think it's critically important to understand that it's not just what we're calling self-care. I think that's become really westernized, really commodified, really identified as particular practices that we go out and do one-off. But it's something I've been calling that comes from the sort of monastic tradition as a rule of life. What are the communal ethoses that we say we live by that include our spiritual practices, that include our healing practices, like was modeled at Standing Rock, where our we don't go into our movement work unless we're doing our healing and spiritual work because they're so symbiotic. We actually can't move forward unless they're all ingrained at the roots of our community, going back to even that roots diagram from the very beginning. So that to me is a major shift in how we think of it. And again, how we think of healing as a central piece of what we're building rather than the thing we add on the side, or when somebody's in an emergency, or once I'm so burnt out that I can't move anymore, then I get a massage, which like all that's going to do is just process a whole bunch of new physical information in your body that can't take it because we ignored it for like 6 months, right? Like, so that's also why it doesn't feel good to have the one massage, right? Because all it's doing is literally expressing your pain, you know, and it may be an outlet, but it can feel overwhelming if it's not a sustained way of being, a rule of life that we're existing by. So that to me is a critical baseline. And again, people just starting to think about how are your movements building, how are your organizations building from the ground up in a way that looks dynamically different and are merged. Some of the conversations I've been having recently is like, we still very much have like, we have the healers over here, we have the organizers over here. How are those communities symbiotic? So they're not building two separate things, but it's actually all part of one ecosystem that's deeply connected with each other. Because we can get siloed even in that, right? They seem like they're working together and side by side, but there's still sometimes two different conversations happening, which is also why I think the structures of movements aren't necessarily shifting, because those two dialogues, those two communities are still somewhat separate from one another and what's happening. And again, going back to healers, I've had so recently, so many people go, oh, my healing work, I want to commit it to organizers and activists. Well, if you don't know how movements function, if you don't understand what organizers are doing, then you're not actually you can't be helpful yet. You can be helpful, but not yet, not fully. You know, you can do a one-off practice like an aromatherapy session or a yoga class, but until you understand how they function, it's real hard to not be siloed as like a side thing. So it's also, it's healing community people also doing work to learn and be in and be connected with the communities that they actually want to support and be part of those communities. And then I spoke somewhat about the crisis trauma triage piece before, but I do want to articulate, I want to speak about that again, just briefly, in the sense that both moving through Standing Rock and then being in Charlottesville and then seeing these other, and then St. Louis, coming after that in terms of like the increased, continued distress that's been in St. Louis, but increased distress even more so in the last few weeks again. We're in a very particular political moment. We're in a very particular activist landscape. And for me, coming from healing side first and learning organizing second, it was this awareness that of a few things, that these aren't going to be necessarily isolated incidents that we don't need to organize around in terms of how we're going to care for these moments when they come up. That as a healer, there's some accountability to building infrastructure like a Red Cross, so that we can actually care for each other across these different spaces. Because when a community is in its highest state of distress, this is also where things are siloed, which was what I noticed from Charlottesville, was like, you're in acute state of distress. The people that could help have already helped in the front lines moment, and now they're in distress. And then the additional care providers that are in the community are not trained or equipped actually to know yet how to handle or deal or address or be in support of what's happening. And so you need bridge space. And that's where like this sort of national community of being able to be connected with each other across movements, across geographic locations, and people being able to be connected around what their needs are, so that one, we can start to train people to do this kind of emergency response, and that our movements are connected enough that people know they can ask for that, that can be a support that's built in. So I just want to throw that out there as a sort of understanding of this sort of necessary piece in this moment that the last year has showed me distinctly, beyond building just the infrastructure in the communities and the movements that are existing, that we will also need to support each other in these new ways, specifically around healing, because the trauma is a specific thing when it's a crisis mode experience that happens, and people really do need care the soonest possible, people that understand that kind of need. And they need to be able to know that they can ask for it, because that's the critical moment. When a major trauma happens, that is when our brain and our body decides whether it's going to stay stuck in distress mode, or it's going to be able to bring itself back down. And so the longer you stay stuck in distress mode without getting help and support, the harder it is to come out, and the more easily that can move its way to post-traumatic stress disorder, which is that longer term way of being stuck in stress mode. So to kind of, and this is again why we've seen that, crisis response become, this model from Red Cross, the military model, was very good at one thing. I mean, they're very good at traumatizing people by putting them in war, but they also were probably where I learned the efficiency of creating healing that actually, like mental health support that would show up right on the front lines, right at the very end of Iraq, Afghanistan, like the major arc of that war. They started to learn, well, no, you actually have to treat people's pain as soon as humanly possible. So while they're still there. So I just want to say that to say, one, those traumas are real and they are critical, and that we are going to learn how to be able to help each other get through that, so that people don't get stuck in that really high crisis mode response. There was one other thing I was going to say about that, and I don't remember. And then just the third piece that I want to highlight in terms of healing on a macro level is going back to, spoke a little bit about it in terms of the arts and that project, the Crane project that I was talking about, but particularly with marginalized communities, particularly with communities of color, one of the areas of my deepest focus right now is this idea of reclaiming rituals, reclaiming ancestry, as this idea of mending a broken circle. So this idea that the circle was broken through colonization by the total annexation of people's capacity to connect to their rooted spirituality, their organic rituals and practices, and that reclaiming those rituals and practices that were always built out for all the things that hurt us. They were organically built for lament, for grief and loss, for pain, for trauma. There's rituals to return from war. There's rituals, to move through cycles of life. There's rituals for spiritual integration at a constant, and it constantly woven in. They were organic to the way that tribal and indigenous civilizations functioned. So reclaiming those in this moment in general, but even more so in the space of social action and movements, I think is a critical piece. And you see there are people starting to do this in very particular ways. And so I've seen happen, the Black Lives Movement, the movement for Black Lives, I've seen some really interesting ways that people are starting to reclaim tradition inside of activist space. And I just think that's critically important to lift up and to continue to prioritize. One of the examples that I give of how this is really tangible, of like the annexation of practices and then the reintroduction and sort of the Western trauma around it, that is drumming. So drumming is in every tribal civilization across the world, was a profound part of every ritual practice, organically, without any real, there was no science behind why it was happening, but it just happened. And colonizing forces came in en masse to pretty much every culture that included drumming, and decided that because the drumming was part of these rituals that people didn't understand, the colonizing forces didn't understand, they tried to eradicate or disband drumming at all possible and pull it out of most civilizations and most community groups as something dangerous. I mean, the massacre at Wounded Knee in the 1800s, one of the greatest instigators of essentially the mass murder of all the people at Wounded Knee was the fact they were dancing around a circle drumming, and it was seen as a force of violence. And so they went in and massacred everyone. So it was annihilated out of tradition, this idea of drumming. And then we fast forward to maybe 10 years ago. Science discovers that a certain set of frequencies creates a decrease in depression and suicidality and trauma response in people. Those set of frequencies happen to be identical to exactly the set of frequencies induced by drumming. So essentially, drumming heals all of our crap. And it was woven, it was broken out, sort of the access to healing in many ways was broken out and taken away. So science discovers that these set of frequencies equivalent to drumming are actually the way to heal us. So they build all these scientific studies about it. They create a machine called the biofeedback or neurofeedback machine that costs thousands of dollars that you can now bill insurance for because it's a medical machine. So there's biofeedback machines and neurofeedback machines that cost thousands of dollars, that cost people however much in insurance plus co-payments to actually go to doctors' offices and use. That essentially was an organic traditional ritual of all tribal civilizations that always existed, that now has become commodified and medicalized and was always there in the first place. So all that to say, I just think that's a fascinating specific example of how we get rid of the things that inherently heal us, or how we are forced to lose the things that inherently heal us, and how necessary they are. And so I think reclamation of ritual, reclamation of history, reclamation of tradition and practices, and when we talk about building up the infrastructure in a new way or a newly embodied way inside of movements, bringing that piece in inherently to how things are functioning and how we're looking at our communal space, our healing space, and how we're not siloing out healing, but what do our rituals look like now? You know, how do we embody and embolden those spaces that may be existing or new in terms of bringing people back into focus. So we're coming close to the end of time. So in terms of like tangible practices and tools for people to take, I think the foundations of practices like mindfulness meditation, like yoga, like movement and embodiment, I think those are critically important, again, as long as they're like pursuing those in ways that whatever you're gravitating towards, if it's a certain kind of mindfulness or meditative practice, if it's a certain kind of embodied practice, if it's a certain kind of creative practice, that it's not just when I feel like I need it the most, but rather how do I want to build a life out that I'm committing myself, you know, as much as I'm committing myself to my work, that I do get up every morning and I'm going to do this meditation practice for 10 to 20 minutes, you know, that I'm going to close out my night by drawing or painting, that I'm, you know, in the middle of the day, I'm going to take time to take a few breaths. I think that's the easiest gateway for people, honestly. If you haven't or you're not engaged with practices, start with just breathing. There's a real simple practice called 3-part breath that comes out of the yoga tradition that is done often in yoga classes. And if you don't know it, you can just Google 3-part breath, and there's audio and video that guides you through it. But essentially, it's just breathing intentionally through the center of your body, inhaling and exhaling. And just learning how to do that, honestly, is the baseline for internal care. It's the baseline for even negative thoughts, negative emotions, or extreme responses to situations. Just being able to take a few moments to take a few breaths, I think, is critically important. And being able to explore what are the rituals and practices that have meaning for me, or if I don't even know how to isolate what those are, where do I start looking? You know, like in doing a lot of work with ritual reclamation in communities of color, it's been really fascinating to see everybody's journey in terms of like, what are you gravitating towards as your practices? Like, what part of your people and your histories do you most feel connected to, that you're being drawn into? You know, finding people reclaiming, you know, Yoruba traditions and Bruja traditions, and finding different organic, natural ways of connecting back, and ways that aren't, you know, like really centered around people's histories, right? Like not necessarily the commodified, like natural medicine, not that it's all commodified, but this idea of like, particularly for communities of color, like like Standing Rock, like what are the herbs of my people, right? Like what are the specifics of what I come from? I think that's really beautiful. And when we think of building those roots, can be really grounding and rooting for people. And then starting to think just in that structural way, I think is just as important in terms of movements and organizing, is like, what are the foundations of the ethics, the principles, and the rules of life that I want to carry for me, but also what do those conversations look like of how I want to do that in my community? How are we doing it already, maybe in ways that we're not even naming, that are healthy and that are empowering and that are communal? And what are the ways that what are the holes there too? Like, where are we not connecting with each other? You know, looking back at the movement cycle, you know, in the disillusionment phase, do we all disperse from each other, burnt out and fried out? You know, in the heroic phase, are we all manically moving at such a pace that we can't stop and be with each other and have conversations or process those things that happen that are disruptions? So just starting to look also at the rhythm beyond rule of life. I've been talking also about rhythm of life. Like, what are the rhythms of the ways that things function in my life, in my community's life. And I think also there's imperfection in everything. So the other thing I'd like to say, like I've been referencing the symmetry at Standing Rock, and I also think that that kind of ecosystem is real hard to sustain. I mean, that was a temporary community, right? Like, it wasn't a community that was meant to last forever. So also thinking about what's practical and pragmatic and possible, and knowing that, like, you know, even at Standing Rock, I feel like I was there in November. So I was there at this sort of beautiful, epic moment where everything had just like sort of found its way. And I think a big piece of that was a deep connection of community across organizing to healing to spiritual practice to general doing life together. I think bringing those pieces together as close as possible is what helped make it be what it was. And at the same time, it wasn't able to hold itself forever that way either. So I think also in that, giving ourselves permission for the ways in which we can't do it perfect, the ways in which it is a process, that there's so much possibility, but we're still experimenting and figuring out what this all needs to look like in this moment. And so also giving ourselves permission to fall down and to be tired, and more than anything else, even because this has been the most prevalent thing I've seen, is like, what are the ways that you can release your guilt about just feeling your feelings or about just being tired? I think we need a whole gamut of rituals that are just around guilt, guilt and shame and movements, because all of that gets in the way of us doing the beautiful things, building the community that we want, caring for ourselves in the way that we believe. That guilt that just it's so in the way. So working through that in community and then in our own selves, to give ourselves permission to just be human and to need time to restore. So we're just about at the end. I'm going to close with a practice. So if you just want to get comfortable wherever you are, and if you can, ground your feet into the floor. If it's comfortable for you, you can gently close your eyes. And if it's not comfortable, just find a fixed point, something to look at that doesn't distract you. And then going back to that root place in ourselves of breath. Noticing the length of your inhales, and the length of your exhales. Noticing how breath is moving through your lungs in this moment. And then slowly and gently begin to expand that breath. So on your inhale, as you breathe in, imagine filling up your lungs with air like a balloon. And on your exhale, releasing all the oxygen from your lungs and letting it go, letting it go, letting it go. On your inhale, breathing in fully and completely and deeply. And on your exhale, releasing and letting go, letting go, letting go. Another full and complete breath in, filling your lungs up with air like a balloon. And on your exhale, releasing and letting go. Letting go. Letting go. And then moving into a relaxed state of breath, whatever is comfortable for you. And just take a moment to scan down your body from your head all the way down to your toes. Noticing the places particular to you where you hold tension or stress. Noticing where your muscles are tight or sore. Maybe around your jawline. Maybe through your neck to your shoulders. Maybe your arms down through your hands to your fingers. Maybe your legs, your feet, and your toes. Just paying attention to what your body is telling you about where you're holding your stress, your attention. Then on your next inhale, breathe deeply into those pockets of stress and tension. And on your exhale, as you sigh out, imagine releasing even just a little bit of that tension and stress. On your inhale, breathing deeply into those places of tension particular to you. And on your exhale, releasing just a little bit more. Imagining it falling away and onto the floor. One more deep breath in, breathing into those pockets of tension left in the muscles of your body. And then on your exhale, a full and complete sigh out. Letting go, letting go, letting go. And then relaxing your body into the chair. Relaxing your feet into the floor. Take a moment to bring your focus in your mind on one thing that brings you joy. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a place, maybe it's a particular memory or image in your mind. But just bring your focus and attention inward on that representation of joy, envisioning it fully and completely in your mind. Imagining it in all of its color and shape. Whatever that is particular to you, that holds you in a moment of joy in this moment, in this space. When you feel your body, your thoughts, or anything external distracting you, just bring your attention back in on that expression of joy. Know that you can always return to it whenever you need it. The same way you can always return to your breath, return to grounding in your body. Knowing that these are resources you can carry with you wherever you go. And then slowly and gently bring some energy back into the muscles of your body. Maybe wiggling your fingers and your toes. Maybe shaking your head from side to side. And then slowly and gently opening your eyes.
Thank you, Teresa. I want to, I just have so much gratitude for everything that you just shared. There was so much power and intention, and I really look forward to taking these practices back to my community, and looking forward to seeing you in Chicago.
Yeah. Yay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Like we said before, this was recorded. So if you'd like to access this at a later date, we're going to be sending out that recording to everyone. Thank you all for showing up and being present, and sending you all the blessings, love, and light. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.